Good evening, everybody. My name is Bert Dicht. I am Vice President of Membership for the National Space Society. And on behalf of Larry Ahern, Vice President of Chapters, I would like to welcome you to our Space Forum this evening, 2021, the Space Year in Review. So thank you again for joining us. We haven't had a Space Forum or Town Hall since the beginning of November. So we're glad to be back, and I will be explaining our schedule as it comes up for the rest of the year and also for as we start 2022. So again, thank you for joining us. Like always, I'd like to do a little bit in terms of just going through our quick agenda. We'll have a discussion of our virtual etiquette, a few announcements, the upcoming Space Forum Town Hall schedule, which is pretty short right now, and we'll get right into our program. And then a few closing comments as we end tonight. So in terms of our virtual etiquette, I just want to remind you that feel free to submit a question. It's best to use the Q&A function. That's only seen by the panelists, and it's much easier to sort out and get right to the questions. So feel free as the session goes on to submit a question. There were a number of questions that were submitted prior, and our speaker, Larry Boyle, will try to address some of those as he goes through, and then we'll actually try to get some answered at the end of the presentation. To comment, feel free to use the chat function. Be respectful of the panelists and audience if you're doing that. You can also use that to submit a question. We'll try to pick that out and find it and put it into the Q&A functions. Just again, just a little easier to use. I would encourage you, if you are using in your setup, use the speaker mode. That way it centers in on whoever is speaking, works a little better that way. So now let me get into a couple of quick announcements. I always like to encourage some donations to NSS and our cause. So if you are enjoying our programming, please feel free to make a donation. We just had Giving Tuesday here in the United States, and we sure could use your donations to help support our cause, but we appreciate all you do in terms of your membership and support of NSS. I will put this link into our chat just so you have it. Also at the end, I would encourage everybody, just please complete the Space Forum survey, the post-forum survey. It only takes a couple of minutes to do it, and it's anonymous, and your feedback really helps us in planning future events. So we look forward to your comments after tonight's session. As I mentioned, I'll talk about what's coming up next. We actually don't have any more meetings in 2021. We've got a lot going on in terms of some internal NSS activities, other things, and it's just best to wait until the new year. We do have a tentative date for the next one on January 13th with a speaker on the Webb Space Telescope. So look for more details about that toward the end of this month or early next year, and you won't miss it. We'll make sure you get the invite. We have other big plans for 2022, some additional astronaut speakers, talks about Blue Origin and also hopefully SpaceX. So we're looking forward to some great presentations and hope to keep you really informed about what's going on in terms of space and space settlement. And again, I thank you all for your participation. We are pushing 50 of these space forums and town halls since we started this back in April of 2020. So it's been a great programming, and I want to thank everybody who's participated. So now let's get into our program. We have a lot to cover in terms of the whole year 2021. And it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists this evening. You probably recognize them both. They've been previous speakers. In fact, our main presenter, Larry Boyle, did this presentation last year as a recap for the 2020 year. But first, I'll introduce our moderator tonight, Jim Plaxco, an NSS colleague, current president of the Chicago Society for Space Studies, and a longtime space activist, presenter, and artist. And we're great to have Jim here to lead the discussion and ask the questions. And our presenter is Larry Boyle. Larry is the past president of the Chicago Society for Space Studies and actually the current vice president. But as a full-time librarian, he started putting together and gathering information to put together an annual review of space. And he's been doing this for many, many years. It's become very popular. So we are glad to have him back to make this presentation this evening. And we look forward to a really informative session tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to turn this over to Larry. So Larry, it is all yours and we look forward to a great session.
Okay, thank you, Bert. Let me start sharing my screen. And is everyone seeing the
it is
first slide?
That's perfect. You got it. It's coming up perfect.
Okay. Well, as was mentioned, I've been doing this for many years. And for us sitting here on the ground, this picture kind of gives an idea of what it's felt like, at least for me and for a lot of other people as well. But in space, a lot has happened this year. In the whole world, about 72 countries actually have some kind of space programs. And most of them are quite small, and there are several that are actually quite large. There are 14 that actually have some kind of basic launching capabilities for putting small things in orbit. And then there are 6 that are really very large and full service space programs. That's in the United States, Russia, China, Japan, India, and the European Space Agency, which is a collection of different countries. And there's also quite a lot of private action taking place in space. There are on the Wikipedia page, they actually list over 100 different space companies doing all sorts of things. And we don't have any final figures for 2021, but in 2020, the total is estimated at $446 billion of activities in space. This blue is actually commercial, and this is commercial infrastructure. So you can see that the commercial section of this spending is really quite large. And that this number is actually probably an underestimate because there are a lot of secret military programs going on as well. Started out this review in the so-called new space section. These are private companies that are operating in space for the purpose of actually making a profit. And as I said, Wikipedia lists hundreds of them, and there are very, very, very many of them. And they are working towards creating at least $1 trillion space economy in the near future. We're already near $500 billion, and in 4 or 5 years, they think it might get to a full trillion. So the big events in the new space section was actually the age of the billionaire joyriders in space. This happened in July for the most part, and there were actually 2 billionaires who flew in space in July. Richard Branson in his ship called the Virgin Galactic, and Jeff Bezos in a capsule his company has created called Blue Origin. And that was also a suborbital launch. Jeff Bezos announced that he was heading to space on July 20th, which is the anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing. And a few days after that, Richard Branson decided and announced that he's going to go up earlier than Jeff Bezos, actually 11 days earlier. So this was kind of competition. He's going to beat Jeff Bezos. And he actually succeeded in doing so. On July 11th, his Virgin Galactic flied him and his crew to a suborbital mission, and they got up about over 50 miles high above New Mexico. And he had a lot of fun and got a lot of publicity for it. And then 11 days later, Jeff Bezos also reached space. This time he went 65 miles above the sky in West Texas. And Mr. Bezos actually has gotten some criticism because some people are comparing his spacecraft to Cornelius Vanderbilt's yacht. In the 19th century, Vanderbilt built the largest steamship in existence as his private yacht. And a lot of people are saying, oh, these guys are kind of creating space monopolies. But that's something I agree with. In addition to Jeff Bezos and his brother, they also carried Wally Funk, who was at that time was 82 and was the oldest person to get into space. And she, in the 1960s, was part of the Mercury 13 program. This was a completely private.
Sorry to interrupt. Your voice is coming through a little garbled. Might be best to turn off your video, and that might help.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt, everybody.
Not sure how to turn the video off.
There's a little camera.
Lower left corner, the microphone.
There's a, yeah.
Microphone icon.
And then there's a little camera next to it. Just hit that.
How's that?
Okay, you're good to go. Thanks, Larry.
Okay, and in addition to the Mercury 13, there's also a Netflix video on it, which I haven't viewed, but it's available if anyone wants to look at that. Bidding for one of the other seats on Blue Origin started at nearly $3 million, ended up at $20 million. And that actually was bought by the father of this kid who's 18. And the father is a hedge fund manager in the Netherlands. And he bought this seat and then gave it to his son as a present for his 18th birthday. So he actually became the youngest person to get into space. And the oldest person was also on the mission. And Blue Origin is really setting up to do this every couple of months. And their next flight was actually set for October 12th. They announced that soon after the first successful mission. And on this one, they actually did something which was a fantastic public relations object. They got Will Shatner, the original captain from Star Trek, to go up on a space voyage with them. And it's interesting that Shatner didn't have to pay for his trip. He was put on there as a marketing tool, and so they didn't charge him anything for it, and it was well worth it. The other people who went up with him spent about $250,000 for their seats, and they did get back down, got a lot of attention, which was the whole point, I'm sure, and it worked very well for them. And in September, there was actually another mission, a first all-civilian mission to orbit. The Bezos and Branson had gone to suborbits. This was an orbital flight for 3 days, and they used the Falcon 9 Crew Dragon system. One of the members of this Inspiration 4 crew is a very, very successful entrepreneur, and he paid $250 million to SpaceX to basically rent the Crew Dragon for a 3-day flight into space. And he picked some other people to come along with him. And this was basically this guy's present to himself. It was just because he always wanted to go into space. And one of the things SpaceX did, since this capsule wasn't docking with anything, they replaced the docking mechanism with this cupola so that the people on board could come out and get really good views from space, from orbit. And there was actually not too much information put out about this launch. One of the main reasons is because it was a private indulgence, and there were no public relations persons attached to it. And so once the crew got launched, communications ended. There were no PR people to push it out to the media. So very little attention was paid to this. They did have one unfortunate event. the toilet actually broke. He served not into the cabin, but into the below the cabin. So they had some smells for a couple of days. But SpaceX has now fixed that. Some of you maybe have heard of Boeing Starliner. When NASA set up the commercial crew system, they did not want to be into a position where they might be broken by an accident and be shut out of space. So they put up two systems, SpaceX, which is now operating, and Boeing Starliner, which was supposed to be the backup for SpaceX. And you can see this is the size of this capsule. And they did try an unmanned mission in last year, and the software was very badly done. So they had to redo the software. They were preparing to launch the second test with the new software, and they discovered some problems with the valves were sticking in the propulsion system. They couldn't figure out what was going on with that. So they had to take it out of the launch system and take it back to the factory. They still haven't really figured out exactly what's going on. So we're not sure when the next test with this system will be. And the crew for the first private visit to space, which is being arranged for next year, probably in January, is a $55 million price tag. This is from a company called Axum, which is made a deal with SpaceX to lease the Crew Dragon for some of its space missions. And there are more private astronauts on the way. Blue Origin, as I said, is setting up a routine subspace flights every couple of months. And Virgin Galactic expects to do that starting at the end of 2022, plus the Axum flights to the International Space Station. And all of this has created some questions. Some people are saying, are we letting space monopolists corner space? It's not something that I agree with, but it is a sentiment that is out there. And it even made the New York Times claiming that Musk is creating a world where we're all trapped in. I would not use the word trapped, but there are some people who do. So we should be aware that there are some who have some differing opinions from what we have for these operations. Now, SpaceX, while it is willing to lease its Crew Dragon to tourists, is not primarily focused on space tourism. Their primary business is launching unmanned satellites to space. And in January, they actually launched 143 satellites on one launch. These were a bunch of very small CubeSats and other smallest craft sizes of microwave ovens and things like that, bigger ones. They also have the program called Starship, which is their super heavy lift vehicle. And in May, it actually succeeded in having a landing where it didn't blow up when it set down. It had a few of those. And Starship is basically Musk's program or system for colonizing Mars. It's going to be a very heavy lift vehicle, much stronger than the Saturn V. And he hopes to plant a colony sometime in the 2030s on Mars. I certainly hope he succeeds. And he also has a program called Starlink, which is a broadband satellite service, which is designed to give internet access to all the unserved areas, the rural areas and other that are not presently served very well by other broadband services. They have a rocket called the Falcon Heavy, which is currently the most powerful rocket in operations. And it's had a 2-year hiatus. But in 2022, as you can see, there are at least 5 missions on the books for 2022. There have been schedule slips with various missions, which is why it hasn't flown for 2 years. None of these slips are Falcon 9's or Falcon Heavy's problem. It's all the customers who are having problems getting their capsules, their satellites to work. Several of them are from Space Force and are classified, so we're not sure exactly what's going on. And they also have a planetary launch for NASA coming up. And the Falcon 9, their smaller booster, has actually been chosen to do a commercial lunar mission in 2024. So SpaceX is doing quite well this year. Blue Origin is Jeff Bezos's company. And in addition to setting up a routine suborbital missions, they made a proposal for commercial space station, Blue Origin and another private space company. And this space station would basically have NASA as the anchor tenant, and then they would rent the rest of the space out to whoever is interested in it. And Blue Origin actually wanted to do a human launch lander, a human lunar lander, and they came up with a proposal in January for the Artemis system. We'll talk about this a little later when we get to Artemis. And so there are a whole fleet of moon landers set for next year, including from Israel and several other countries, India. And so moon exploration is really getting into the commercial areas. Even NASA picked a small launcher company called Firefly Aerospace to deliver its science payloads in 2023 to the moon. And this Firefly calls its system the Blue Ghost lander, and we'll give it to NASA or basically anybody with the money. And Rocket Lab, which is another small space launch company, actually got a contract for a mission that it had crapped out last year, and now is going to get a second chance to put small microsats near Mars. So moving on from the commercial sector, which has an awful lot of activity going on, most of it in small spaces, and the countries that have done most of the launching, the United States, took quite a few of the 123 that have been launched so far. Most of the civilian program is, of course, NASA's, and you get a lot of information on NASA. And one of the things people were worried about is, will Biden and pursue Trump's space program? And apparently it seems to be taking place. There is plenty of evidence that at least in that one area, the area of space, Biden and Trump do seem to agree. Biden's budget for NASA was $24.7 billion for the next year, for 2022. Most of the manned missions for NASA, of course, are focused on the International Space Station, which has been the case for many years now. A piece of space junk actually damaged part of the International Space Station this year. It was on the Canada arm. You see it's circled here. And it was either a small meteorite or some kind of space debris that punctured that bit of the arm. Didn't hurt the operations of the arm, but did damage it. There was this incident with the newest Russian capsule landing, taken to the space station, attaching to the space station. We'll talk about that more in the Russian section, but it did manage to tilt the space station 45 degrees out of what it was supposed to be. And space agencies are now planning for an extension of the ISS. They want to either extend it to 2030 and then start with the commercial operations. NASA is looking, like I said, for future commercial space stations. Blue Origin has given one, and there are several other proposals out that NASA is looking at. They want to go with the same thing they did with the crew launchings, to move from their owning the space station to commercial space stations. The other big manned program that NASA has is the Artemis program, and that is to return human American astronauts to the surface of the moon. It's named Artemis because Artemis in Greek mythology had a twin brother called Apollo. And they thought that Apollo landed before, and now they want to do Artemis, which is a duplicate, basically. And the Biden administration is backing the US moonshot. There was some worry since this was a Trump idea that they might drop it, but no, they are moving forward with it. They have even begun picking launchers for some of the parts of the Artemis program. The Gateway is actually a space station, a small space station that will be in orbit around the moon and will be used when the astronauts come to land. They will dock first at the Gateway and then go back down to the surface. And Musk's SpaceX, and another win for them this year, actually got the contract to develop the spacecraft. that will take astronauts from the gateway to the moon. And NASA actually had to pause work on that because Blue Origin actually filed a lawsuit against NASA for giving the contract to SpaceX. And just in October, that lawsuit was actually dismissed. So they're now moving ahead with the SpaceX contract. The government space launcher is the Space Launch System, and that has been impacted by COVID-19 somewhat this year, and there's also have some other developmental problems. The Orion crew vehicle, which is to be on top of the Space Launch System, is now, the first flight test has been delayed to 2024, and that is partially because of COVID, but also because of some technical difficulties they're having. Now, the NASA's Inspector General has said that the 2024 moon landing, which was scheduled, just is not going to be feasible. They blamed development delays on the spacesuits, but there are also other problems, though the spacesuits are causing them some difficulties. Lockheed and GM actually have presented a proposal to NASA for a new moon buggy project, but NASA hasn't quite bought that yet. From NASA's manned programs to its unmanned exploration of the solar system and beyond. In this year, in June, NASA announced that it's heading back to Venus. NASA hasn't had, in fact, no one has had a mission to Venus in many, many years. NASA hasn't had one for over 30 years. And in June, they actually announced that they're going to do 2 missions. The reason for 2 missions is that in 2020, there was some hints of life in the clouds of Venus. That's been downgraded a little bit since then, but that hint was enough for NASA to approve 2 missions to Venus to be launched sometime in 2030, one of them an orbiter and one of them a lander. And just a week later, the European Space Agency also announced that they're sending a mission to Venus, probably around 2032. We'll talk a little bit more about theirs when we get to the ESA. Mars got a real attention with NASA and with the rest of the space programs in the world too. There were 3 missions, unmanned missions to Mars this year. The first was the United States, the Perseverance lander, which got to Mars in February, used the Skytrain system to put its Perseverance rover on the surface. And this is the first picture that Perseverance sent back once it was landed on the surface of Mars. And they're even having some interesting experiments for the interest National Space Society. They actually have an experiment that uses the atmosphere of Mars to make oxygen, which they're looking for future missions. And that actually succeeded earlier this year. The Perseverance rover has found signs of flooding on Mars, which was something they hoped and expected. They even have a microphone on the Perseverance rover where you can hear the sounds of Mars, including the sounds of Perseverance using its laser to zap rocks. You can find this at the mission's website. And they're also supposed to collect samples for later picking up and returning to Earth. The first attempt came up empty. They drilled into a rock, but the rock wasn't hard enough. And so when they pulled the sample container out, it just fell into dust. They picked another rock, and this time, the second time, they did in fact get a sample and put it aside to be collected in a later mission. What got the most attention with the Perseverance rover was the Ingenuity Mars helicopter. This was carried inside Perseverance and then was dropped off on the surface of Mars, and the Perseverance rover moved far away. They weren't sure if this was going to work, and they didn't want to take the chance of the helicopter crashing into their rover, so they keep at least several hundred feet of distance between these 2 vehicles. Well, the helicopter did in fact fly on Mars. It made a hovering mission, and it's had several other missions as well. And after the tests that Ingenuity went through, they decided to extend the mission to use it as a scout for Perseverance. And as of November 16th, There are up to 16 flights, usually short hops, around Mars, where Ingenuity looks and sees where they hope to send Perseverance. So it's being used as a scout for Perseverance. Another mission that they have on the surface of Mars is the InSight mission, which is a lander and look into the inside of Mars. And it did, using Marsquake records, show that Mars, the red planet, its core is actually half the diameter of the planet, which is quite a surprise. And they're not quite sure at this point what it means, and they're still working on that. They had a heat flow experiment, which was supposed to dig down into the surface of Mars, at least 12 feet, maybe even further, as far as they could get it, but they couldn't get it more than a few inches. And after 2 years of effort, they decided to cease this effort. There are at least two explanations for this. One is that they landed by accident on top of a buried rock, which is certainly possible. And there's the other suggestion is that there's something about the subsurface of Mars that makes drilling harder. And they haven't decided which it is at this point. Another reason for closing down the heat flow experiment is the dust is settling on the solar power panels on the InSight mission, and the power levels are dropping. So moving away from Mars into the asteroid belt, NASA in November actually launched the first attempt at an asteroid redirect mission. This is go to a small satellite with the moon, and they will crash into that moon to see how much it redirects the mission. So this is the first attempt at a defense of Earth mission. Moving out onto Jupiter, the Juno mission has been around Jupiter for a couple of years now, and they've been returning a lot of really good data. And they have what's called a Juno cam. And that is, the public can vote on what they want photographed on the surface of Jupiter, and then it's released immediately to the public, and the public can do whatever they want with it. So there's a lot of very nice pictures created by the public. And while Juno is aimed at Jupiter, it does sometimes fly by the moons. And in June, they actually got a pretty close to the Ganymede, Jupiter's largest moon, and got some fresh, thick pictures of it. NASA has the Europa Clipper coming up, and they've actually chosen a launch vehicle for that. And that is SpaceX, so another win for SpaceX this year. And that will be flying in a couple of years. Now, for deep space exploration, they have the Hubble Space Telescope. And the most serious thing that happened this year with the Hubble is they had a really serious problem, a real glitch. It actually took almost over a month to fix it. It was apparently some kind of computer problem, and they fixed it by switching out to the backup computers. But Hubble is now back in operation and returning full science observation and releasing new images. The replacement for Hubble is the Webb Space Telescope. And that after 20 years, is finally ready for launch. In October, it arrived in French Guiana for a launch by the ESA, and it's getting ready. There was actually a few days before they were going to launch it, and one of the clamps holding the satellite to the launch vehicle released for some reason. And they had to check it for vibrations. They didn't find any problems, but they did change the date to December 22nd. So Hubble is now ready, Webb is ready to launch on December 22nd. The other event that happened with the Webb telescope is that some people have complained that they should change the name of the James Webb Space Telescope. James Webb was a leader and a bureaucratic leader in the 50s and 60s, and the federal government was not too friendly to LBG people during that period of time. NASA went back into the history books, and they said that based on what he was told, there was no evidence that he was especially discriminatory against LGBT, and so NASA decided not to rename this telescope. And a kind of sad mission point in NASA, the third man on the Apollo 11 capsule Michael Collins, actually died this year. He was 90. And moving on from NASA to the other part of the US space program, the larger part, and that's the US Space Force and the military in space. The military Space Force has been around for a couple of years, and they actually got a budget of 17.2 billion this year. And it is known that they have some classified budget as well, but it's classified, so nobody knows how much they're actually spending. So this is the floor of the Space Force spending. It's probably more. How much more is hard to say. The chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, this gentleman here, actually made a speech saying that the USA needs more offensive space systems. And they're now negotiating with Congress about that. The military has an X-37B military space plane. It's kind of looks like a shuttle, but it's a much smaller. This is a 6-foot man compared to it. And here you can see it compared to the space shuttle. So you see it's much smaller. It's on its 7th mission in orbit. It's been up there for over 500 days. And the Space Force and the National Reconnaissance Office, which actually builds spy satellites and whose budget is completely secret, actually picked some launchers, SpaceX again with another win, and the United Launch Alliance system, which is building this Vulcan launcher, which will be operating within the next few years. Space Force is looking for tactically responsive launch providers. That is, people who can get their missions up into orbit fairly quickly. As a sample of what goes on in the military space budget, the Air Force has actually been working on a space-based ground radar tracking system from 2018, but they didn't reveal it publicly to anyone or say how much money they were spending on it. But this year, they did in fact reveal it. And so now we know that that's being spent. So there are a lot of programs, classified programs, which are spending money, but we just don't know just how much they're spending. This is the Secretary of Defense, and he's at the moment negotiating with Congress to establish a Space National Guard. The negotiations are stalled at the moment, so we don't know if that's going to happen, but there is some progress toward it. DARPA, which is the Defense Department's advanced research projects, is actually trying to revive space nuclear propulsion for future military operations near the moon. So they're spending money on that as well. Moving away from the United States to the second largest space program in the world, and that's the program of Russia, it used to be Russia, now it's China. And China has over 300 satellites in orbit, and that was in March, so there are more in orbit at this point. They had several firsts this year at Mars, low Earth orbit, and at the moon. Moving outward from low Earth orbit, they launched the core module of their space station, which was launched in April. And immediately after that launch, they had problems. The rocket that launched it weighed 18 tons, and it made an uncontrolled reentry into Earth's orbit. And there was some comments about that being a bit irresponsible, but it did eventually crash harmlessly in the Indian Ocean. And they're preparing at least 1,000 science experiments for when the space station is fully operational. And that is from all over the world, mostly from China, but also from other places as well. And this is just a diagram of what that first core module will look like. You can see it has several docking units. It has a remote manipulator arm, like the Canada arm on our space station, portholes and various things like that. And this is what it will look like when it's finally finished. This is the module that has been launched into orbit. And then these are modules that they will be adding later on. They expect to be finished sometime in late 2022 or 2023. And this kind of thing presents challenges for us and for the rest of the world, and opportunities for China. Russia actually wants to send cosmonauts to the Chinese space station. It will probably take a couple of years before they arrange this, but they are working on it. They sent one short duration crew to the space station who just managed to put it all together and make it livable. And then in October, they sent their 13th manned mission into orbit to put these 3 astronauts on their new space station for 6-month voyage. And they docked in October, and they're up there now, and they will be up there for 6 months. The moon also had a first for China. They actually returned a sample of the moon's surface with an unmanned vehicle. And that was the first time that an unmanned vehicle was returned moon material, moon dust, since 1974, when the Russians stopped doing it. And they're actually now beginning to get science results from these samples. They showed that there was definitely a lava flow 2 billion years ago on the moon. Everybody suspected that, but now they have proof. And they also displayed a set of rockets that they're building, and they're aiming at a crewed moon landing mission sometime in the early 2030s. They are very eager to get this picture for real. This is a Photoshop of an Apollo 11 with the Chinese flag added in. They want to have this for real, an actual Chinese astronaut on the surface of the moon. And they've also announced that they're going to build a research base. China and Russia are going to build a research base on the surface of the moon. And in June, they actually put out a really nice pamphlet, which is available on the internet, with a lot of pictures and diagrams showing how they intend to do this. The picture I picked out is, here's a Chinese astronaut, here's a Russian astronaut looking over their joint moon base. So that's what they hope to have sometime in the 2030s. And they did announce that they're willing to have international partners, not just Russia and China. Would they accept the US? I don't know. Would the US want to be part of it? Again, not sure. The next big event from China also took place on Mars. This was the second mission that went into orbit around Mars. And this was the first time that any country had put an orbiter, a lander, and a rover on the surface of Mars on their first attempt. And it was only the second time that anybody has put a rover on the surface of Mars, a successful rover. So it was very successful for them. After a couple of months in orbit, they put their rover on the surface of Mars. And this is the first picture that rover sent back from the surface of Mars. And once it was operational, they moved it out from there. The US actually used one of its satellites to take this picture of the landing site for that vehicle on the surface of Mars. And they took this selfie. The rover is equipped with what amounts to a smartphone that it can lay down somewhere on the surface and take pictures of itself without making mosaics. The main reason for this was so that they could emphasize their flag on the surface of Mars. And they are justifiably proud of this mission. And they are really now getting data back from it. And once it's moved out, it actually moved past its own parachutes where you let it land on Mars. And they're also planning for the 2030s, at the earliest, a Mars sample return mission. And I said they're having heavy lift rockets, which they're using for their roadmap into space. They are also working on science in space, telescope in the Hubble range, basically planned for 2024. And this is actually a demonstration that has been approved to be basically a space garbage truck, picking up garbage in space. The interesting thing about that it's a private company, Origin Space, which is a Chinese private startup. The Chinese government refused permission for private companies to do anything in space until the year 2014. At that year, they lifted that ban. And now it does take some time to get a space program going. And now you're beginning to see private Chinese space companies. This year, they're beginning to show up, and there'll be more in the future. And they're actually talking about using their heavy lift rocket to conduct a space-based solar power station. So that would be interesting if it comes to pass. Moving from China to another space power that's in Russia, used to be the biggest, also ran. most of their manned program is, of course, focused on the International Space Station. And there was a small leak in their space station in January, which they're assessing. And basically, the Russian space parts are beginning to wear out. And it's a real problem in the Russian part of the space station. The US part is actually also wearing out a little, but we're lasting somewhat better than the Russian part. The Russians had a final module that they launched to the International Space Station in in July. And this module has actually been in production for about 20 years. For 2 decades, they've been trying to build this, and it really expands their living space and scientific experiments as a robotic arm actually provided by the Europeans. So this was a very big event when they docked it in September. And just a few hours after they had successfully hard docked it to the space station, something went wrong with the autopilot in this 20-ton module, and it decided that it had to move away from the space station. By this time, it had already been hard docked to the space station, so there was no way it was going to move away. What it actually succeeded in doing is tilting the space station 45 degrees off of its usual angle. They did manage to get it back under control and put the space station back in place before this module actually tore it apart. And they are now wondering what happened with these thrusters, and they're doing an assessment. They haven't made any announcements exactly what is going on. But then in October, they were testing the thrusters on one of their Soyuz spacecraft, and the thrusters went out of whack again. And they again tilted the International Space Station, again almost 45 degrees, and they managed to get that back together before it did any permanent damage. The Russians in last month actually tested a Russian anti-satellite mission and blew up one of their own defunct satellites. And that created a cloud of debris that really could have threatened the space station crew. They actually had to close all the doors. They were not connected anymore in case one of them was breached, and the crew went into their return capsules, powered them up, and so that they could be ready to leave on a few moments' notice. And they were in those capsules for at least 2 hours while they assessed this debris field. And even recently, the concerns about this debris field has caused a delay in a spacewalk that had been scheduled. So it's still causing problems. They did have finally, just November 26th, a new docking module arrived at the space station. This one didn't have any thrusters that went out of control, so that seems to be working well. None of this has pleased Vladimir Putin, who is the president of Russia, and he slashed the Russian space budget to kind of say to them, if you're screwing up like this, we're not going to continue giving you money. And they also announced at the same time that he told the space reporters to stop reporting on the space program, again, as punishment for not doing all that well. So at least the Russian people are going to get as much information about their space program as they have been getting. One good thing for the Russian space program, though not for the government part of it, Soyuz actually delivered some cosmonauts and a film crew to the ISS. This lady here is actually an actress who has a part in this film that is being made on the International Space Station. And the plot of the film is that there's an astronaut who has a heart problem of some kind, and she plays a doctor, and she has to make a zero-G operation, heart operation on this astronaut. Not sure when the film is going to come out, but they have gotten the film that they wanted, and they're returning to Earth. They return to Earth. Thus, they beat Tom Cruise, who has announced that he is going to film a movie at the space station, but hasn't announced many of the details. Moving from Russia, still staying in Europe, is the European Space Agency. European Space Agency is different because it's not a single nation state. There's actually, in 1975, the nations of Europe Western Europe, France, Great Britain, Spain, Italy, Germany, decided that they couldn't compete as individuals with the big space powers, but they could if they pooled their resources. And once the Cold War was over, they actually expanded toward the east. So they now have some Eastern members. And in fact, Lithuania became a member just in October. They have a complete set of launch vehicles, including the Ariane 5. And the Ariane 5 is, as I mentioned, going to launch the James Webb Space Telescope on December 22nd. The reason for launching it on the Ariane is that the ESA had been part of the Hubble space program. And they built the solar power panels, and they wanted to continue to be part of this program, of the Webb program. And they decided, after some negotiations with NASA, that what they do is provide NASA free of charge a launch on Ariane 5, which is why the Webb is going up on an Ariane 5 from South America. And in addition to Ariane 5, they're working on an Ariane 6, which they hope will be 40% cheaper. Again, this is SpaceX's competition driving somebody to build a different, new rocket. They had been intending to launch early in 2022, but they now are pushing this Ariane 6 back to late 2022. They do have a capsule, a laboratory at the International Space Station called Columbus, which they spent over $1 billion on. They have an unmanned program as well. This unmanned program, Bepi Colombo, is actually a Mercury mission designed to go into orbit around Mercury, but they didn't have the rocket power to put it directly in orbit. So it has to make 5 flybys. So it'll be a couple of years before it actually settles into orbit. But this was their first flyby and the first science pictures from this European mission to Mercury. As I mentioned earlier, they added a new orbiter to the Venus Armada, making 3 programs, 3 missions that have been announced to go to Venus in 2030. And so 2030 is going to be really busy around Venus. There's more to the space budgets in Europe than just the ESA. The European Union is the larger organization, a larger political organization. And it has now added a space budget of about $18 billion for 7 years. The EU is so large with 27 members, it takes a long time to negotiate their budgets. So all their budgets, not just their space budget, go in 7-year increments. And so this is about $2 billion a year being added to the European space budget. And now the European Union will be in charge of the future of the space industry. The ESA had been trying to plan it, but now it's moved to a much larger European Union. Germany did announce that they're starting a space command this year. And this points out that the European countries have pooled their civilian and commercial projects in the ESA, but they also have some military projects. They're smaller than in the US, and they're mostly secretive. So again, there's some doubt that exactly how much money is being spent on space in Europe. Moving from Europe all the way across Eurasia to another space power, which is Japan, and they have also a complete space program. They're spending $4.4 billion on their space activities this year, which is a considerable amount of money. They have a launch system they call H2, and they're working on their H3 system. Again, this is the competition from SpaceX. This is going to launch more and be cheaper, and hopefully for the Japanese compete against SpaceX. They have a laboratory at the space station, which actually has a pallet for exposing experiments to the vacuum of space. They have had crew members at the space station over the years. They also have a small airlock that they use to launch small commercial CubeSats into orbit from the space station. They have a unmanned program as well. And this samples actually December, so almost a year ago. The probe was launched in 2024 to this asteroid, and it's just returned, and they're just beginning to get the science back from this sample return. They're also working on a Mars probe, This is still in the design phase. They haven't launched it yet, but it'll be focused on the Phobos, the moon of Mars, one of the moons of Mars. Another Asian space power is India. And India has a very robust space program. This is their family of rockets compared to a 12-story building. These HM Ambassadors are Hindustani Motors subcompacts. They're people in India know immediately this is a couple of tons. So this gives you some idea of what they can do. India's space programs were really thrown off by COVID-19. All the programs have been affected somewhat by COVID-19, but India's was the worst effect. They had to suspend all launches of any kind for a period of 7 months, and they're now just getting back to launching. They are planning their first manned space mission. They were originally planning for next year, 2023, but COVID-19 has now knocked it back at least a year, possibly more. But they are still working on this manned orbital mission. They are working on for next year, a flight to the moon, an unmanned mission to the moon, which has also been affected by the COVID-19. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there were 72 planets or nations with programs on the planet. Obviously, can't cover all 72 of them, but a few should get some notice. The United Arab Emirates is a small country in the Persian Gulf, and it basically sits on a sea of gas and oil. So it is very, very rich. And a couple of years ago, they decided to diversify their economy. And one of the ways they're doing that is starting a space program in order to draw some of their people, their younger people, to STEM education. And this year, they did manage in February to be the third mission to actually get to Mars. And this is the first image they returned in February. And since then, it's been in orbit around Mars, and it's been returning good data. They actually captured pictures of an aurora on the surface of Mars. So as I say, they're returning good science from this spacecraft. South Korea is another fairly small space power. And this year, they actually had a launch with a homegrown rocket. This rocket is completely designed from the ground up. Every nut and bolt is native to South Korea. And they did successfully launch the vehicle, but the mission that it was carrying, the satellite didn't work out quite properly, but they still did manage to launch a homemade rocket this year. Another rocket tester launch was Iran. This is a program that a lot of people think is probably, their space program is just a cover for developing a ballistic missile program. And they did this year announce that they launched a test satellite that can deliver satellites to orbit from a new center in northern Iran. The US was upset about this, and they're imposing new economic sanctions on Tehran. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. Questions of does life exist on Earth has fascinated people. The Perseverance is actually one of its main goals is to look for life on Mars. But the search for life on Mars or in the cosmos actually inspired NASA's next 10-year plan. It's decadal survey, which they put out every 10 years. And there are going to be 2 telescopes, giant telescopes on the surface of the Earth, and a space telescope specifically looking for searching for life. Speaking of life in a sort of a bit unusual way, the Defense Department earlier in April confirmed a leaked video of unidentified aerial phenomena. And then they released from the Director of National Intelligence an assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena. This name is the new one for UFOs. UFOs have so much baggage attached to them that they wanted to get away from that name. So they renamed it unidentified aerial phenomena. And they did create a new study group in November. Haven't had any results from that at this point. This is just a picture of what the Navy pilots have caught on their cameras on their fighters. And the Galileo project is actually a private system designed to look into this unidentified aerial phenomena. They're with private money, getting a scouting mission together with it. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by a scouting mission, but they're at least working on something to look into this. And kind of a smiley thing, earlier this year, a meteorite actually crashed through a woman's roof and landed in her bed. So she woke up rather suddenly with a space rock lying next to her head. And she was grateful that it was next to her head and not on her head. So that's a very brief overview of what has happened in space in the last year. And so if we have any questions, I can try and answer them. So.
Great, Larry. Thank you very much. For anyone who has any questions, please post them into the Q&A section. And we also had some questions submitted early. So I'm going to go ahead and fire away with those questions. So Larry, is there something you expected to happen in 2021 that didn't happen?
I was expecting that Virgin Galactic would actually get more flights than just one. They did get the one, got a lot of publicity, but they then got into some trouble with the FAA. They went outside of the designated area, and they had some legal troubles with them, which is why one of the reasons they put off till 2022 for beginning their regularly scheduled problem or launches. And another one of those questions is anything that surprised me about the space accomplishments. I was as surprised by the Inspiration 4 mission, both because this guy was able to afford basically a joyride into orbit, and also that it didn't get as much attention as I thought it deserved. So any other questions you wanted to?
In that vein, what is the one space event of 2021 that you feel really stands out from the rest?
It's not one event, it's the beginning of space tourism to suborbit and orbit. That has been talked about for many, many, many years. This year, it actually became a real program. So that I think is going to be really important in the future.
Okay. There were a couple of questions. I'll cut first to one about rocketry. What about Rocket Labs? What has been their big news this year, or have they had any big news this year?
Standout news, no, but they are steadily putting more satellites, small satellites into orbit, and they've got their business up and running, and there doesn't seem to be any way to anything blocking their road to space, to a continuous space exploration. So I think that was what Rocket Labs really did this year that should get attention.
Okay. There were a couple questions with respect to space debris, which seem to be particularly appropriate with respect to Russia's rather reckless ASAT testing. Has there been any progress made on, let's say, the policy fronts about how to protect the commons of space, or has there been any discussion about any types of sanctions on Russia for doing what they did?
The sanctions on Russia, yes, people are talking about it, but nothing has been applied at this point. As for making progress on space debris in general, if you call having talks about it, then there has been some progress, but those talks haven't come up with any binding agreements or rules of the road or anything like that. But they are discussing it quite a lot. And there are, as I mentioned, the Chinese have a private company that's doing some space debris removal. And the Europeans are also have a mission to start removing debris, but there is no general overall plan for it. A lot of discussions about those plans, but nothing general.
Now, it seems to me related to the question of dealing with space debris. There's also the question of space traffic management.
Yes.
So now that space is becoming a much more multinational with both public and private actors, is there serious planning going into figuring out how to coordinate space traffic management?
The Federal Aviation Administration is working on a space management plan for the United States. And there are some discussions at the UN saying we should really have a space traffic management system. But so far, they're only discussions. Nobody has actually, none of the countries have come up and say, oh, we're going to do it, or we're going to create this agency or give it to somebody to do. So it's definitely being talked about. And there definitely could be problems because a lot of private spaceports are being developed, for small launchers at least. And we don't know where it's going to end at this point. It's still too early in the international discussions about this.
Okay. One last question, and that has to do with your expectations for 2022. Is there any particular event that you see is happening next year that will be perhaps as impressive as the space tourism flights this year, or something that's going to be a key step forward in space commercialization?
There are several companies trying to land on the surface of the moon, private companies. There's one in Israel that has just gotten the money together to try again. So I think that private companies successfully landing unmanned on the moon would be a major step forward. And Musk and SpaceX with the Starship are actually planning, not in 2022, but probably in 2023, a manned orbit around the moon, basically a replay of Apollo 8. And that would be very spectacular too, as well. I think if the first human return to the vicinity of the moon is by a private company, that would set some real precedents for the space program in the future.
Okay. I see that Larry Ahern has raised his hand. So Larry, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yeah, what you think next year or soon after we'll be able to stay at a hotel in orbit?
Not next year, but the space reef that Blue Origin is proposing will have some, it's not going to be totally a space hotel, but they will have some rooms to rent, shall we say. And not sure when that's going to happen, sometime later this decade. And there's always a problem now with COVID-19. It has affected all space programs, especially India's, but even here in the US and everywhere. And I hope it disappears, but with this new Omicron variant, who knows what's going to be happening with that? So that's a question mark in the future, in 2022 at least.
Bigelow is not in the picture anymore, right?
Yeah, he's closed down I think it was COVID-19 that finally prompted him to close completely down. But he may reopen it, but who knows?
Larry Joe Rosher has a question. Any comments regarding yesterday's first meeting of the Biden administration National Space Council?
They did issue a 7-page report outlining what they plan to do in space. I haven't had time to read through it very carefully, but I hope that it's a sign that the Biden administration will continue with the space program in the future. So it's so early at this point, and it just happened, like you say, yesterday. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on with that.
Okay, thank you.
You
This
can get that space plan on the web. If you're
is it on the, I would just say search for National Space Council and use the site qualifier and just stick gov in there, and that should get you there pretty quickly. Let's see, we are past our end time, so thank you very much, Larry. And for those of you who were here, I earlier in the evening posted into the chat the Zoom link for this coming Sunday's meeting of the Chicago Society for Space Studies, at which our speaker will be Larry Boyle, who will be giving his space year 2021 in review for our chapter. Anyone here is welcome to attend that meeting as well. So feel free to drop in and join us, and perhaps you'll think of a question between now and then, and maybe we'll see you on Sunday. So Larry, thank you very much. Bert, thank you very much for having us as your guests this evening, and I will turn things back over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Jim. Larry, if you could stop sharing your screen. Just there we go. Perfect. And let me just get this back into a good mode here. There we go. So everybody, thank you so much. I really want to express our thanks to our speaker, Larry Boyle. That was a really comprehensive look at space in 2021. So thank you, Larry. It must take an enormous amount of research to get all of that and cover the whole globe. So fabulous.
I collect slides basically almost every day. I check the web, and that's why I build up a lot. In fact, when I started the final preparations, I had over 400 slides.
Wow.
Cut them down to just about 200, but there's so much going on that you have to leave a lot out.
I'm sure, but no, very comprehensive. And I like the fact you go beyond what's happening in the United States. There are space programs all over. So thank you for the very comprehensive look. And Jim, thank you as well for moderating tonight and handling all the questions. We really appreciate it. It was a great session. Everybody, again, we're going to be closing out the year. So I do want to extend my thanks to Larry Ahern, my colleague from NSS, who has helped organize and plan all these space forums this year. It's been a very successful year for us. So we thank you so much for that, Larry. And also to our logistics expert here, Fred Becker, who manages the technology and make sure we're covering all the bases as we move forward with these presentations. So everybody, I'm going to just share my screen one last time as we close out. And so we close out with our great panelists tonight. So I do want to thank everybody for attending today. So I'm wishing you a great evening for those in our current time zones. If you're in tomorrow's time zone, have a great day. And of course, have a great weekend. And since we will not be connecting again until after the new year, just wishing everybody a happy holidays, a very, very happy new year, and wishing you all, again, staying safe. And we look forward to seeing you in the new year. And hopefully that first session will be on the 13th of January. And we'll let you know about what's going on as we get closer to that date. So again, thanks everybody. Thanks to Larry, thanks to Jim again, and thanks to Fred and Larry Ahern. And we'll see you all next year. Take care, everybody.
All right.